Welcome to the BMRC's Fall Research Speaker Series. We're nearing the end of the series, but we have some great talks still to come. Today, we are joined by Dr. Brandon Alston, is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at The Ohio State University. Brandon Alston is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at The Ohio State University. Before joining Ohio State University, Brandon completed his PhD in sociology at Northwestern University, where he was a doctoral fellow at the American Bar Foundation and a pre-doctoral fellow with the Ford Foundation. His research examines how surveillance systems operate across poor neighborhoods, prisons, and parole programs. Law and Society Review and other outlets have published Brandon's research. And joining Brandon as his discussant is Dr. Richard Benson, an associate professor of the Black radical tradition in education at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Richard Benson, the second, is an associate professor of in education at the Department of Education Foundations, Organizations, and Policy. He received his PhD in Education Policy Studies, specializing in the history of education from the University of Illinois in 2010. As a historian of education, Benson specializes in the Black freedom movement, the Black radical tradition, and transnational social movements. Before we begin, I would just, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the BMRC, I would like to just give a short introduction to the BMRC, and then I'll turn the floor and the screen over to Dr. Brandon. So the BMRC, for those who are not familiar, is an consortium of 28, and we're expanding consortium. We probably have some new members by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. This expanding consortium of 28 members who strive to, we try to cultivate and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, and understand and preserve Black experiences in the Chicago metropolitan area. So you can see some of our current 28 members. As I said, we're expanding, and I think you will probably hear about some new members joining us soon. Within the last year, we've had the Haitian American Museum of Chicago join us. The Black Social Cultural Map at the Honey Pot Performance has joined us recently, as well as the National Public Housing Museum and the Chicago Covenants Project. So you can look at our website and to learn more about the work that they are doing to do research and activate the archives of Black experiences in Chicago. As I said, the BMRC since 2009 has had a summer research fellowship, and we try to steward the work that scholars, artists, and writers and public historians do about Black experiences in Chicago. We've awarded more than 130 of these fellowships, and we've had more than 30 publications, books, plays, books of poetry, and we have some exciting new books coming out from some of our recent fellows, so stay tuned for that as well. And this is just a sample of some that have come out in the past. Just to let everyone know that next year we actually will not be hosting Summer Fellows because it's our 20th anniversary, and in honor of the BMRC's 20th anniversary, we'll be hosting a symposium on Black Chicago in the summer. And so if you know someone who might be interested, we invite you to submit abstracts by January 5th, and we look forward to a very exciting symposium next summer in Chicago. And last but not least, especially as we're in this, what they call a giving season, we remind you that contributions to support BMRC's work, things like the fellows, are, it's tax deductible, and it helps us to keep these programs going. And also our upcoming talk, I think this will be the last one for this year. We have maybe one more in early 2026. Will be PhD candidate Mariel Perkins will be discussing the writing of Ida B. Wells. So you can stay tuned for that for December 12th. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Brandon Alston.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone see that, my slides? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. All right. So the title of my talk is Governing Through Surveillance, How Criminal Legal Policies and Processes Transform Black Neighborhoods. So what I'll be able to talk about today, I'll talk a little bit about some relevant research that has informed how I'm thinking about surveillance. I'll touch on some of my research questions that have motivated this research. I'll talk a little bit about the data and the methods. I'll talk about the findings, which are split between talking about the policies that inform surveillance. So this is case law, legislation, laws on the books, policies that are in play. And then I'll talk about surveillance as a process, so how people experience it based on what I found in my research. And then I'll conclude with my contributions again. So my research is thinking about surveillance as governance in two ways. So surveillance of Black neighborhoods has served as a significant strategic solution to governance in Chicago. And so this is one key thing that we can see across time, particularly in the 20th century where I'm looking at. And then second, surveillance is legitimized by the potential results of detecting street gang, violent, and drug crime. And these are the 2 points that I'll focus on mostly in the presentation through the historical research that I'll present, as well as some of the interview data. And then finally, this is one of the points that I think is super relevant, but I don't have time to get to it today in the presentation. But this is that the technologies, discourses, and metaphors of surveillance have become increasingly visible features of Chicago governance of Black people and places. And so we can see this with police observation devices or blue light cameras that you can see here in this photo. And then we also can see this with body cameras that were initially implemented and on police officers patrolling predominantly Black neighborhoods like Inglewood, where I do my research. And they were used as a veneer to increase police accountability, but we see that they've had disparate impacts with that. So in cities like Columbus, Ohio, right, we see that in the state of Ohio, actually, that the state has now required citizens to put in requests in order to receive access to the footage, and that would probably charge up to a total of $750, right? And so we can see how the police have taken control over footage that's coming out, and that's a key part of what's happening with surveillance. We also see that Black residents are increasingly using cell phones to record police, which is another area of my research. And then we also see that police increasingly characterize community members as the eyes and ears of police. So we see community members becoming citizen spies, right? This whole rise of informants that becomes very popularized in the 90s with the shift to community policing. So how I'm thinking about surveillance is heavily influenced by Michel Foucault, who identifies surveillance as corresponding with and emerging from the modern prison model inspired by Jeremy Bentham in the Panopticon. And so he's looking at disciplinary power emerging through knowledge gathering activities such as the examination, hierarchical observations, and normalizing judgments. What's really important here are the conceptual takeaways. So some of the historical chronology is a little different that I'll get into next. But these pieces around the examination, hierarchical observations, and normalizing judgments are really apt, right? So hierarchical observations represent the monitoring of individuals' bodies from someone that has a position of authority or power. And then normalizing judgments, the measuring of an individual's behavior against some standard with the goal of creating obedient bodies. So Simone Brown has come in and rectified some of these key pieces as it pertains to understanding surveillance and brought race into the fold in a sharper focus. And one of the ways that she's done this is by drawing on some of Frantz Fanon's work, which has been really instrumental to how she's thinking about racialization and surveillance coming together in this concept of racializing surveillance, which refers to how racialization is fundamental to the enactment of surveillance and reifying racial boundaries with violent and often discriminatory treatment. One of the key pieces here with emphasizing Blackness as a key site through which surveillance is practiced is shifting our understanding of when surveillance is emerging. And so shifting from this model of the Jeremy Bentham panopticon to understanding slave ships as mobile prisons that are informing the type of research that we're so in shifting us to think about slave ships as a key mechanism for the emergence of surveillance as it relates to Blackness. So with this history and this revision of how we're thinking about surveillance, one way we can think about stop and search surveillance is as a process that racializes individuals' bodies and contributes to that. So, with these insights in mind, surveillance reflects disciplinary power. It reflects, it serves as a legal examination, right? We can think about these hierarchical observations emerging in tandem with these structural forces like the white gaze, normalizing judgments, reflection of police discretion on the grounds, and tied into racial discrimination and status. So these are my research questions. How did Chicago use police surveillance to control Black neighborhoods like Inglewood during the 20th century? How do Chicago residents interpret the experience of police surveillance? So you can kind of see that these questions are getting at different angles of what's happening within neighborhoods like Inglewood, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I got there. So first, archival methods. I visited two archives this past summer. So the first was the Harold Washington Library Center and the Chicago Public Library, and then the Chicago History Museum. I consulted a lot of different collections at both of these places. Well, at the Chicago History Museum, mostly focused on what was happening with Inglewood at the Harold Washington Library Center, and then consulted a number of digital archives, particularly relating to the laws on the books and policies. So Illinois' General Assembly, Legislation and Laws, the Invisible Institute, which has a great archive on the John Burge torture scandal and regime in Chicago that took place from the 70s through the 1990s. And then I also conducted interviews that we can think of as oral histories with Black men living or receiving services in Inglewood, and the age variation in the sample ranges from 18 to 73. And one of the benefits of the variation in the sample is that I was able to find some of the police reports in the archives this summer, as some of the men came of age during some of the times where they were filing police reports on paper. So I mostly recruited these men by meeting them on the street, asking them about their experiences in the neighborhood, and then also with the support of one community organization. And then I used in vivo for analysis. So I coded primary sources, secondary sources, interview transcripts at multiple stages. Analysis is ongoing. I'm largely thinking about the archival analysis as getting at these macro level laws and policies that influence the surveillance of Black neighborhoods, and then interviews providing this micro level insight about how people are experiencing surveillance on the ground. So one of the key things that I have found from my research is that there's this informal introduction of stop and seizure in the early part of the 20th century in Chicago. And that is contributing to what I'm referring to as the structuring the surveillance of the streets. And then we have the formal introduction or implementation of stop and frisk in the 1960s. And one consistent current that we see throughout this is the focus on the threats of street, gang, violent, and drug crime, which I'm showing is all getting at structuring how police officers are able to use surveillance on the streets. So these are some of the policies that I've identified through the various research archives that I've been able to touch base with. So the first list is looking at federal legislation that's coming in the 60s. One of the key pieces that's happening with Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988 is really empowering police officers to do street level searches in order to prevent drug crime. Then we see some things coming in the 90s and the 2000s. All of these policies are still very much so actively embraced. The only pieces that have changed in terms of federal legislation is what has changed around the Fair Sentencing Act that comes out of that revises some pieces around the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and that comes in 2010 and is the Obama administration introduction. And then we can see some pieces with federal case law. Terry v. Ohio, which I'll talk about later, but also Adams v. Williams, which is a case that I encountered in the archives, as well as Illinois v. Wardlow, which is another case I encountered in the archives and starts in Illinois, but then becomes a Supreme Court case as well. And then some other policies that pertain to the state and local level. So the Illinois Stop and Frisk statute that comes in 1968 And then we can see a consistent concern around gang crime and what's happening with that. So Operation Clean Sweep, 1988, Gang Congregation Ordinance, Operation Headache, and then the community policing, a policing policy comes in 1993. It's a formal introduction, but one of the key things to remember is that this is one of the ways that the police are saying they are transforming citizens into the eyes and ears of the police themselves. Then some other cases, like I said, I'll talk about Wardlow as well, but these are some other cases that have pertained to what police officers are able to do pertaining to stop and searches on the streets. So the emergence of stop and seizure is innovated during the Prohibition era. Initially was intended to create procedures around what police officers are able to do around searching places for illegal liquor and make arrests as necessary. And the 1920s, when it was initially being introduced informally, the Chicago Police Department Commissioner, William Russell, explained that his officers would continue using stopping and seizing no matter what the state's attorneys or the judges do about it. So this was an important piece of really being able to see the power of police discretion. And so one of the things I try to really emphasize is that police themselves are policymakers. So what's happening with stop and seizure is not something that's originating from law on the books and flowing to the law in action, but rather the police are putting this in action and then it's informing the process for the law on the books. And so they increasingly use their discretion to expand stop and seizure. So in the 1930s, the NAACP Legal Redress Committee argued that their efforts to eradicate policy gambling, police have taken upon themselves to break into homes, beat up citizens, and search people on the streets without probable cause or legal process. And so we also can see police discretion as a key piece of how police are able to expand their authority to use stop and search. In the 40s and 50s, we see Chicago police officers switch to specialized police squads that are supposed to target certain neighborhoods to produce as many arrests as possible. This was done in tandem with police officers using data on crime statistics in order to substantiate their interventions in these neighborhoods. And so we see police officers formally introduce this in 1956. They're covering 3 to 6 blocks each, and they have 11 officers. And so really identifying these high crime areas that have been labeled as high crime for intervention. So for the neighborhood that I'm interested in, the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, we can see here in 1920 that it was not a predominantly Black neighborhood. And this was one of the key pieces of what I kept consistently seeing in the archive, which is that before 1940s, there's not a lot happening pertaining to race in the 1940s before that time, right? In the 40s is when things start to shift. And so we see the changing dynamics of Englewood. We see stop and seizure being a key part of that. We also see the closing. So we see the closing of in the 1950s, we see Englewood residents pressuring their alderman, Sidney Jones, so much so that he introduces a city ordinance to halt the task force illegal searches. We also see that the crime and gang task forces particularly are targeting Englewood. So a study conducted by the police department in 1958 found that Black districts like Englewood, Woodlawn, Fillmore, Lawndale received task force visits at a rate of 20 to 28 times that of white neighborhoods. And consistently, Englewood has been a site of police brutality, police violence. Even in 1965, right, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference holds a demonstration in Englewood over police brutality because of this. So as I said, during the 40s and 50s, we start to see the demographic shifts in Englewood. And so you can see here with this graph that there was a huge shift. This was a very violent process. So white rioters overturned cars, facilitated riots and violence because Englewood was changing, right? And we see this, we know that there were a lot of Black in-migration flows into Black neighborhoods, and there were a lot of consequences for that in terms of neighborhoods not having the resources for people to adjust to them as well. So we can also see that Inglewood has been predominantly Black, even after the 70s, so the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. So the demographic data, really, we can see that the population is decreasing. The number of residents in Inglewood is consistently decreasing. The residents, however, and that's also happening with the Black population. However, despite the demographic decreases in the population, the Black population continues to make up a sizable share or predominant share of the population overall. So coming into the 60s, Chicago Police Chief Orlando Wilson was very much so a huge advocate for aggressive policing and preventative patrols. And his goal was to enforce constant surveillance of every corner of the city by putting the police officer in the location and time. And at the time, the criminal is most likely to be there. And so that was one of the key pieces. He was very key and apt to enforce stop and search and to let police officers know that he would support them if citizens exercise their right to petition the government and sue the police officers directly. And so after what's happening with Wilson, right, Wilson is a key piece in advocating for stop and frisk to formally become law on the books. And so while the previous governor, Governor Kerner, right, vetoes the Illinois law, the new governor, Samuel Shapiro, signs the law in 1968 after taking office. And this is the law on the books here, temporary questioning without arrest. And the key piece here, right, is detention and temporary questioning will be conducted in the vicinity of where the person was stopped, right? So that means on the streets. And then the second piece, search during temporary question, which is the most pertinent to my research. When a peace officer has stopped a person for temporary question pursuant to section 107.14 of this code and reasonably suspects that he or another is in danger of attack, he may search the person for weapons. If the officer discovers a weapon, he may take it until the completion of the question, and at which time he shall either return the weapon if lawfully possessed or arrest the person so questioned. So this initially emerged as a way to prevent police officers from getting harmed on the street or violent crime, right? This is what is being presented in the law in the books, but also the conversations and discourses around these laws. These laws have since been expanded tremendously and really are able for have been expanded through administrative directives so that police officers are able to search for weapons or drugs. So we also see in the 1968 Terry v. Ohio is a landmark Supreme Court case that's focused on the Fourth Amendment that comes in at a time where Illinois is already sanctioning stop and frisk as laws on the books. So this case is a key case for the Fourth Amendment. A Cleveland detective, McFadden's patrolling his beat. He's in plain clothes. He's not on the clock. And he observes Terry and two other men engaging in what he believed to be a stick-up. The question of whether this search was legitimate or not then becomes the basis for sanctioning whether or not police officers can engage in stop and frisk on the streets. And so this was one of the key pieces. The judge in the opinion says the power of the police to stop and frisk, as it is sometimes euphemistically termed, suspicious persons. And this becomes one of the key pieces that sanctions surveillance of neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods like Inglewood and on the street level specifically. The dissent is particularly telling. So Supreme Court Justice Brennan maintained serious concern that Terry will be taken by the police all over the country as licensed to them to carry on, indeed widely expand, present aggressive surveillance techniques, which the press tell us are being deliberately employed in Miami, Chicago, Detroit, and other ghetto cities. And then, of course, one of the key pieces of what's happening with surveillance in Chicago is the surveillance of the Black Panthers. Now, this is a very extensive topic. I only have time to touch on it briefly, but one of the key pieces is that the FBI begins actively monitoring the Black Panthers in Chicago in 1968, and the Chicago Police Department began doing so shortly after. The Bureau surveils Fred Hampton to disrupt the Black Panthers' works, and they use a lot of different tactics, including traffic stops, street searches that sometimes escalate into strip searches. So you can see here in this photo, this is a photo of the Black Panthers being strip searched on on the street by police. And then by the 1970s, Black Chicago police officer Edward Buzz Palmer, co-founder of the Afro-American Patrol League, remarked, "To grow up Black and to be man means that it is almost impossible not to have the ever-present police record. Black standing on the corner in groups on hot, murky nights develop phobias in the minds of white policemen, Blacks who later show up on police blotters as curfew violators." And so by the 80s and 90s, we're seeing the war on drugs and the laws of the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of the 1980s, of 1986 and 1988. And these are sanctioning law enforcement tactics that target street level crimes for investigative stops, searches, and arrests. We later see that this approach to policing becomes an organizational strategy throughout the city of Chicago. And one of the key cases for this is Illinois v. Wardlow. Just in the interest of time, I don't have too much time to go into it in depth, but it is important to think about what's happening in the 90s and 2000s, how the Terry v. Ohio decision becomes a key piece of sanctioning subsequent decisions. And this was a case that was focused on police officers patrolling a neighborhood that had a well-known police reputation of drug activity. And so officers pursue William Wardlow because he's holding an opaque bag. He runs, and becomes the basis for them to pursue him and conduct a subsequent search. So the Illinois Supreme Court says that sudden flight in a high crime area does not automatically create reasonable suspicion. However, the Supreme Court rules in a different direction. They say that presence in a high crime area alone is insufficient, but unprovoked flight is a consummate act of evasion and a pertinent factor in determining reasonable suspicion. So they uphold the search against Wardlow, and this becomes another piece of the puzzle for these policies to structure the surveillance on the street level. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about stop and search surveillance, what this means for the residents who I have talked to and interviewed. So we can see stop and search surveillance as a routine social and legal process that South and West Side residents came of age during the informal introduction of stop and seizure and then the formal implementation of stop and frisk. So one of the key findings that I identify in my research is enforced exposure. So police officers compel men to disrobe and reveal their unclothed bodies, often in public settings. As I mentioned before, there's historical reports of police officers doing this to the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s. And there's also more recent reports of police officers doing this around the country. So one just recently occurred, and this was a Black man who was strip searched in front of his family in Jacksonville. So in my study, I had a resident, Bill, whose record I was fortunate enough to be able to find in the archive. So this is a brief photo of that document. And this is also an excerpt of how he's thinking about his experiences with stop and search. So he says, I mean, just the usual. They would catch me, throw me down, go through my pockets and do all that stuff. But then they got to the point where they would just handcuff you and tell you to get in the car and they search you like that. Shit, they had me drop my pants and everything else. I was in a drug-infested neighborhood where people were selling drugs. People would hide them on their body and whatever else. So they would commonly ask you to do that, drop your pants. So we can see here that a part of what Bill is saying, the usual routine is a part of exposing your body on the street. And that's a way that police officers are looking for weapons as well as drugs. And then I also had Owen, who's a 56-year-old resident, and he said, one time I was on 43rd and I was walking. It was a windy day. They told me they was looking for some robbery suspects. Yeah, this was before I did some time, actually. I was drunk. I said, sir, I didn't do nothing. You can search me. He was like, drop your pants. I don't feel like touching you. I was like, sir, I ain't got no. He was like, drop your fucking pants. I dropped my pants. I remember my boxers just blowing in the wind. Sir, if you as you see, I ain't got nothing. The cop told me to get the fuck home. They just did it to be degrading. And so one of the things that find in my research is that residents are perceiving these stops and searches as opportunities for police officers to publicly humiliate them on city streets, to force them to expose their unclothed bodies, right? And while the case law suggests that they should be able to resist such searches based on their own volition, that's not often what's happening when the law is in action. So my contributions, surveillance has a long and varied history in the city of Chicago. Crime control laws and policies and case laws all allow us to see a consistent interest in structuring the surveillance of the streets. And then we can also see residents who came of age under the formal introduction of stop and frisk. Um, you can see that these stop and searches, they're defining them as events where police officers use their discretion to enforce exposure of their bodies on city streets. So thank you. I look forward to questions, comments, and feedback.
Thank you so much, Brandon. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Benson for his comments.
Great presentation, Dr. Alston. Greatly appreciated. A few things I just want to make a comment on in terms of what initially came to mind when I was looking at the topic and thinking about how some of the work that I've been fortunate enough to be able to come across within the last few years has also piqued interest as it relates to, I guess, the surveillance mechanism, or to some degree, I would say the the industrial complex as it relates to surveillance, whether it's individuals, institutions, persons on the street, day-to-day actors, etc., was was based on work that I was doing with Harold Washington, or on Harold Washington, and I was surprised to a large degree. And I'm not sure if you came across this in your investigation, but for those who are not aware, as early as 1976, Harold Washington had been surveilled by the Chicago Police Department, specifically the Red Squad. And based on those early investigations, I found myself going down a bit of a rabbit hole just as a curiosity as it relates to the apparatus of the city in terms of being able to, I guess, provide, certain concessions to surveil a congressman, senator, and then eventually the mayor, unsuccessful after the first term. And that said, I see that over decades and generations of time, obviously, the police in the city of Chicago have taken on different iterations and also representations, obviously by racial demographics in terms of who's policing, where they're coming from, etc. So one of the questions I have for you is essentially, have you seen between the archives and then also being able to do a comparable analysis in terms of the interviews and then what may be in the archives, a relationship between what policing has been able to do in Chicago in terms of being able to maintain the restrictive covenants and then also redlining? You pointed out in one of the slides that the Inglewood that those who are familiar with Chicago contemporarily all the way up through the late 70s is much different from what would have been in the 40s and the 50s. Then by the time we get to the 60s, obviously with the SCLC that's talking about police brutality and holding rallies, etc., now the city is beginning to open up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the police apparatus is now as progressive and liberal as, this city is hopefully moving toward in terms of removing the red line and removing the restrictive covenants. Have you seen policing, or based on your research, take on the face of, being that white supremacy or maintaining the restrictive covenants in the segregated neighborhoods?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Benson. Yeah, so absolutely. I would definitely say that's a key part of what I have seen in the archives and what I've seen with researchers that are trying to wrestle with what's happening with policing in Chicago, especially as things are shifting after the murder of Fred Hampton, right, in the 70s and the 80s. And then specifically what you mentioned about Harold Washington, I didn't have space to include this, but I do have a quote from him when he's a Chicago House of Representatives member, right? And he says, one thing that most of our white friends do not understand is that measures like stop and frisk in practice are seldom applied in the larger white communities. They are used only against Negroes, Puerto Ricans, Appalachian whites, the uneducated and uninformed. And so I thought that quote really encapsulated some of the things that you were getting at as well, with the role that the Red Squad played in Chicago, a key piece of what's happening with policing and policing interracial contacts in particular, right? So we don't want, we don't want white folks to come over with black folks in black neighborhoods, right? Because then they're probably a communist, right? And that was one of the perceptions that I consistently saw. But yeah, absolutely. Even when Inglewood is shifting and changing, right? The police are a key part of how the riots and the mob action are policed and perceived within the city, right? This key piece around, what's happening to protect their neighborhood versus it being something that's destroying the city, which we often hear with protests or uprisings from Black citizens in the city of Chicago as well.
Thank you for that. As a follow-up, let's return for a second to talking about the Panthers. So the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and the most famous or notable, in many ways, I guess, infamous informant that came to light was William O'Neill, who was responsible for those who may not be familiar, have familiarity with the death of Mark Clark in addition to Fred Hampton, based on his informing and reporting of not only daily meet, or I would say meetings, activities, etc., but then also being able to provide a step-by-step blueprint in terms of being able to access for the Chicago Police Department, again, and including Red Squad. And given that, I think in many ways, especially in the contemporary sense, when I'm assuming in terms of um, the dialogue and the interaction, in terms of you being able to tease out information from residents, I'm sure the issue or issues around stop snitching and snitching campaigns, I'm sure that emerged at the forefront. Can you talk a little bit about, or talk as much as you possibly can, about the histories with respect to um, Black residents of Chicago and the relationships as it relates to either in the words I'm looking for, cooperating, working with, providing information, for the purposes of so-called ongoing investigations. What does that look like? Have you seen perspectives change over time between the 60s of the Panthers, late 60s of the Panthers to the contemporary moments, etc.? Or have you seen a consistency, in relation, in terms of those relationships?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I think one thing that I have seen is this consistent desire for um, police protection, right? And so consistent desire for police protection, but not this unequal protection, right? That we often see that is, usually attached with surveillance, violence, and other key pieces of what's actually happening. I think a key piece of what's happening specifically in the 70s and 80s and in the 90s is this rise of community policing that we're seeing. And you can see this clearly in the Chicago annual police reports. They're coming out with new programs. In the 80s, it's no Newsy Neighbors. And after that, it's, oh, we need community policing and we need a formal program because there's strained relationships with policing. And we need the community members to be the eyes and ears of police officers, right? And then we see at the same time the state is saying, well, if you see something, say something, right? We're introducing that a few years later, and so I think there's a key piece of what's happening in the 90s around community policing, undercover policing, right? That's extending out of what's happening in the city, in what's happening with city policing, but also federal policing with the FBI and these undercover operations, right? Clandestine surveillance. And I think communities are responding, right, with stop snitching campaigns and closing ranks. And we see the Panthers attempting to do some of that work, right, at the end of the 60s, throughout the 70s, to bring community control back to policing efforts, particularly in places like Inglewood.
Brian, I have a two-part question for you. Uh, a portion is actually going to be steeped, or I'd say couched in the contemporary as it relates to tech. And then the other question, or the other part of the question, is essentially looking at replication of Urbane, of Chicago is kind of like a model city with respect to it being an urbane space that other cities, either nationally or internationally, have attempted to, I would say, in many ways, replicate and in some ways almost duplicate, as it relates to surveillance. So the first part of the question is essentially, um, and just a bit of a background for me as somebody who grew up in Chicago, who understood certain parts of whether it's Hyde Park, whether it was contemporarily Bronzeville that we called the low end back in the day, Inglewood, etc. We knew that there were stretches of real estate where you could definitely drive over the limit, the speed limit. So, given that by the time we get to the early 2000s, or I would even say in a conservative number over the past 20 years, due to privatization of the city, whether it's parking meters, whether it's trash, etc. In addition to now the integration of what it is that I learned to be most prevalent in cities like London and Paris, CCTV, or the boxes that we understand. I think probably in a very uninformed matter as it relates to speed light cameras. Can you talk a little bit about, number one, the relationship of tech in the city in terms of what everyday citizens in predominantly black neighborhoods may consider tech in relation to possibly transportation efforts to curtail speeding versus those apparatuses possibly being used, in multiple levels for the purposes of surveillance. So that's part one, and then the second part of the question is: have you been able to, in your research, find contemporarily, and I'm speaking over the past 20 years, other cities that have used Chicago's, I would say, deliverables as it relates to whether it's statistics in a quantitative fashion with respect to whether it's curtailing certain crimes, quote unquote, other cities that have attempted to replicate or duplicate Chicago as it relates to speed light cameras and certain other technological advancements, and then sometimes I would say, for lack of a better word, we'll just say advancements that have been integrated, in by and large into Black and Latino neighborhoods.
I appreciate this question. So one thing that I will say is that when we start thinking about surveillance technology, the conversation very rarely touches on the surveillance in America, right? It's usually centered around what's happening in Europe, right? Specifically London, right? People will say the London Eye, right? They can see everything there. Uh, People will attribute it to China and they'll say, it's a totalitarian society, right? You always being watched. But Chicago actually rivals both of those places with the amount of cameras and the interlocking nature of the camera network. So the camera network is pretty sophisticated. Some of my research touches on that as well. So the blue light cameras, the pods, the police observation devices have been installed throughout the South and West sides under the guise of pursuing safety for the communities. They also cost a lot of money, and they cost a lot of money to power up. So the flashing blue light is supposed to be a deterrence factor, but very rarely are the cameras placed in places that align with where we are seeing crime hotspots emerge, or with and that's mostly because they have to be placed where they can be powered up, right? So they need enough power to be sufficient These cameras are also tied in with the traffic cameras, the red light cameras. They're also tied in with individuals' property cameras. So ring cameras can be tied into the camera network. So I think the last estimate I saw was pushing towards 20,000 cameras within the city. And so research that has come out recently has shown that the ticketing efforts for these red light and traffic cameras are very disparate. So they're concentrated in low income, Black, brown communities on the south and west sides of Chicago. Um, and that's one key piece that's also really surprising because a lot of the cameras, if they're focusing on who they're keeping safe, a lot of them were initially installed in downtown, right? Following 9/11, with this concern that the city has to be secure and that Chicago would be the next city that would be the subject of a terrorist attack. The last piece I'll say is I think for the second part of the question, Chicago is absolutely, a model cities, right? We have the Model Cities program in Chicago. That's a big part of the Chicago history. And then sociologist Bob Sampson talks about how Chicago is this great American city that social scientists should consider as a model or a template for other cities. And I think that beyond social scientists, I think it's widely taken up. So we can see this in other cities that have moved towards becoming more focused on these smart cities. So Columbus, Ohio, where I'm located, that's a big push towards that, right? We're having these police cameras, having them interlock with traffic cameras. Washington, D.C., of course, is a big part of that. And then Philadelphia would be the last city that I would also name as being a part of this. So these smart cities, which of course are being amplified by these data centers that require a lot of power, a lot of resources to fund, but are supposed to be the places where all the feeds from these cameras um, are being actually opened up to. So we're supposed to have people that are actively monitoring things in the city, but we don't actually know if that's happening. And so for residents that I've talked to, as well as police officers are very unclear about where the footage actually goes, and they're only able to access it after a particular crime that they're interested in or investigating emerges. So thank you for the questions. Happy to open up the floor for other questions as well.
Thank you, Dr. Alston. So yeah, open for questions for our last 10 minutes.
Thank you both so much. So if anyone has questions, you're free to type them into the chat or to unmute yourself and ask directly to our wonderful panelists today. I do have a question to start us off if we want to give people time to think. First of all, it's interesting because tomorrow is the anniversary of Fred Hampton's assassination, and the local Black Party, Black Panther historical heritage trail are actually having a visual tonight, to mark his assassination. So that was timely. But I was wondering about you, Dr. Brandon Alston, in terms of encountering these the archives of police brutality and police surveillance, which is a form of violence and intimidation. What is this in the field of archives? We're always thinking about what is the experience. We think about affect, emotions in archives, and what is it like for an archivist to have to, process, get those records ready for someone to use. But then, what is it like for you to encounter that? And so, I'm just wondering, this kind of research, obviously is very, it's critical thinking, but there's also an emotional aspect to it. And have you found that the archives you've encountered have prepared the reader for what they're going to encounter when they're looking at these kind of records? Are there any kind of trigger warnings? Is there just anything? And do you feel like could there be something done, or were you happy with what was done to kind of prepare a researcher to encounter these records?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think mostly because I'm coming from doing these oral histories, these interviews with people, and they're taking me through their felt experience, lived experience of going through these stops and searches and how humiliating and violating they are for them. and so many other pieces that have these emotional responses that they've never talked about with anyone, right? They're been stopped and searched with, their guys on the street, and they just move on with their day, right? So they're talking to me about it for the first time. And I think that sort of prepared me more than anything for the archives. I think for the pieces of the information that I was consulting, there wasn't as much in terms of trigger warnings or things like that. But what I found the most interesting about the police reports that I actually saw was that they were supposed to fill these out for civilians, right? And say where the civilian is hurt or things like that. But a lot of times police officers crossed things out. This is a very common tactic that I saw throughout the 70s and 80s, where they crossed things out and they filled the reports out based on the harms caused to them, right? As the police officer. So they're like, why are we doing this for the civilians? No, the police officer was shot. My partner was shot. And so that really tells you a little bit more about who police are thinking about as the ones worthy of protection. And so that was something that really stood out to me in the archives. And, I remember just from the archival methods seminar and how people think about the archives when I was in graduate school. And that was one of the moments for me that I was like, I would not have gotten this had I been doing another method or even engaging with the secondary source material.
Thank you so much. So I don't want to monopolize, but in a past life, I actually worked for Office of Emergency Communications in Chicago, which, works with the police. And so I have a lot of experience working with police officers. And one of the things, I don't know if you know, the police say, their job is to go home safely. That's
Hmm.
their job. And so that in their mind, they do whatever it takes for them to go home safely. But we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you see from Brendan White. If the blue light cameras are not in areas where crime is happening, does that not mean they are working as a deterrent and crime is moving to areas outside their range?
Yeah, so one of the things I think maybe just to clarify my earlier point is that the blue light cameras are in communities that police officers have identified as high crime. But within the high crime communities, right, when we're thinking about where crime is, we see it that it's actually in smaller areas, right? What scholars call these pockets of crime, right? Some people will say block areas, right? What have you, but it's smaller than a neighborhood. And so because of the um, infrastructural constraints, right, of how much time and energy it takes to actually implement the cameras and keep them powered up, they're not able to always be placed in those hot spot areas that align with where the crime is happening. And so that's one of the things that's really curious about where the cameras are being placed. And this is done by some UIC researchers a few years ago, looking at the cameras installation and what it means for big data in the city of Chicago. But I think that's one of the key pieces around this. So we don't have a lot of data on the footage itself, right? Because we're only pulling the footage retroactively, we can't really say whether the cameras are being effective as a deterrent factor because we would need the footage to say whether it deters someone from engaging in drug crime or street crime or violent crime or things like that. And so if people don't think that they're working, then they're more likely to go about their regular behaviors under the surveillance of the camera.
I do have one question. Dr. Alston, in your data collection, did you happen to gather any information in terms of collapsing, or I would say a collapsing of efforts or integration of efforts between social service agencies and the police as it relates to data gathering? I'm thinking of United Way. I'm
Mm.
thinking of even to some degree maybe even cooperating efforts between like social workers, social service agencies, or whatever for home visits. In certain areas of Chicago, specifically black neighborhoods. Did you happen to find any information pertaining to those? Probably, I would say, uh, coordinating efforts between agencies of the police and then some of the others that I mentioned.
No, so I haven't found evidence of that in the archives, but I do know that some of my colleagues have done some great work on this, particularly in the 90s. Great book, Overseers of the Poor, that's really looking at Black women and how they're navigating surveillance in the home space. And so one of the things I really try to do in my research is really focus on public space and what's happening on the street level. And so that, surveillance is a very vast topic, but that is an important piece of what's happening within cities. And right now, contemporarily, we see that we are in a moment of retrenchment, even more so now with the one big beautiful bill that President Trump has introduced, right? And that is expanding that. But my colleague Spencer Hedworth is finding that even as we're retracting resources pertaining to social services like SNAP and food stamps and things like that, that we're enhancing the policing of those services, right? So what he refers to in this era, in terms of the policing of these of the welfare state, enhancing at a time where we're giving out very, very meager benefits, is very counterintuitive, but also a really important study.
Thank you both for joining us, and thank you everyone who joined us. It was a really, really enlightening, beneficial talk. And it'll be on YouTube in, say, a week or so if you'd like to see it again. And I just want to thank Dr. Alston and Dr. Benson for joining us as well.